Welcome back everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to smoke brisket for beginners. Alright, so we're going to be using the ultimate beginner barbecue, the Weber kettle. We'll start by taking the lid off and then we'll remove our cooking grate. Alright, so now we're going to set our Weber up for a long smoke. So we've got some briquettes here. We're going to be setting up the snake method, also known as the fuse method. So we're basically just getting briquettes, stacking them up in a domino style fashion. We're going to stack these up right around the outside of our charcoal grate. Now, it doesn't matter what type of briquettes you're using. When I'm setting up the bottom layer, I'm always using 2 rows. And I always say the Weber kettle is the ultimate beginner's barbecue. They can do everything you need. You can smoke brisket, you can cook steak, you can roast in them. I can guarantee you'll find one secondhand very, very cheap. Or I bet you've got a family member or friend who's got one sitting in their shed that they haven't used in years. Or even if you wanted to buy one brand new, they're still very fairly priced compared to other barbecues as well. Alright, so you want to go most of the way around that charcoal grate. You just want to leave a gap between the 2 ends because we're going to be starting our snake here with about 12 red hot briquettes. As you can see, our briquettes are set up to fall and burn clockwise, but what we need to do now is add a second layer on top. Now, if you're using larger briquettes, I would just run a single stack through the middle, but because these briquettes are on the smaller side, we're running 2 on top. Alright, and now our snake's set up, we want to get a few firelighters going. Then we'll place our charcoal chimney on top of that. I highly recommend getting one of these if you haven't got one. And then we want to get about 12 briquettes in there, which will start our snake. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes before those briquettes are going to be ready. We want to make sure they are ashed over and nice and red hot. So while that's happening, we'll use that time to trim and season our brisket. All right, so we'll flip it over and we'll just make a very light cut. You don't want to be using too much pressure, otherwise you'll make a big ugly slash in your brisket. So this brisket is nothing fancy at all. This is a Marble Score 1 brisket we picked up from our butcher at Austral Meat. And when I'm looking for a brisket, I'll look for a nice, thick, flat, a nice uniform, sort of evenly sized brisket. I'll always recommend cooking a larger brisket. You get much better results. And if you've got any leftovers, you can always vac seal them for future use. But for now, we're going to get started on trimming up this underside. We just want to work on taking any excess fat and silver skin off. I'm just using our Victorinox trimming knife. Everything we're using in this video today, I'll put links for down in the video description. All right, now I'm happy with that underside. It's nice and even. You want to trim in a way that you're making your brisket nice, aerodynamic and uniform. And you'll find on a full brisket, most of the time you'll have this ugly top flap. I'm just going to work on taking a bit of that off. We can also tidy up any thin edges and just square them off. And there's quite a bit of fat around that top flap. You just want to trim that down as best you can whilst maintaining that nice uniform aerodynamic shape. And because this brisket is on the leaner side, I want to leave a nice coverage of top fat on the flat side. I don't want to leave too much fat on there, otherwise it won't render down properly, but I want to trim that down to around 3 mil thick. All right, so I'm very happy with that now. This brisket is looking beautiful. You also want to take note of any potential areas juice is going to pull up on your brisket, but this one's looking really good. So now let's get this seasoned up. All right, so if you've got a favorite beef rub, feel free to use that, but we're going to be using a 50-50 mix by way of kosher salt and cracked black pepper. Now on its own, that makes a fantastic seasoning, but what we're going to do just to give it a bit more flavor is top it up with some of our steak shooter rub. So now we'll give it a good shake and get this brisket seasoned up. All right, so I'm just going to flip it over. We'll just put a drizzle of olive oil on just to help our rub stick to the meat. And then we'll give it a nice, generous coating in our rub mixture. You want to make sure you get all those edges. Then we'll flip it over and do the same to the top. All right, that is looking awesome. And a rub with a heavy salt and pepper base will give you that awesome bark. So now we're all trimmed and seasoned. Let's have a look at these briquettes. All right, so our briquettes are all ashed over, ready to go. So now we just want to dump them in at the start of our snake. We'll pile them all up at the start there. We can lay a drip tray down. We can lay some smoking wood down. I'm just going to put a piece just after where the snake's burning. Another piece shortly after that. I'll also preheat another piece just here that we'll put on our fire once our barbecue's preheated. So now we can open up that bottom vent completely. Get our lid on, open our top vent right up, and we'll give our Weber around 10 minutes to preheat. So it's really important to give your Weber those 10 minutes to preheat. It's going to clear up any dirty smoke you may see in the first few minutes after putting that lid back on. And it's also going to preheat all those other briquettes to a hot enough temperature that they're going to be able to catch light and burn efficiently throughout this whole cook. So we'll let our Weber preheat and we'll come back to get our brisket on. Alright, so it's been 10 minutes. We can see there's no dirty smoke coming out of that top vent. There's a good amount of heat coming out of there. So we'll open our lid. We can see that snake has started to burn along nicely. So we'll get our piece of smoking wood on where the fire's burning. We'll get our cooking grate on. Then we'll get our beautiful brisket on over the opposite side to where the fire's burning. And now when we put our lid back on, we want our top vent to be opposite to where the fire's burning so that smoke and heat can travel through our brisket and out that top vent. Alright, so we've got some beautiful smoke coming out of that top vent. That cherry wood smells amazing. If you've got thick, heavy, white, bitter smelling smoke coming out of that top vent, there's something going wrong. There may not be enough oxygen flowing through your fire, so once you've got your brisket on and your lid's back on, make sure both of your vents are still wide open for the first 5 to 10 minutes. Also make sure you're not soaking your wood chunks, and you want to make sure your wood chunks aren't too big that they're smothering your fire. And I'm going to look to run our temperature at around the 275 Fahrenheit or 135 Celsius range. So once I get to around 225 Fahrenheit or 110 Celsius, I'm going to start slowly shutting down that bottom vent. Now, if you've got a probe you can clip on your cooking grate to put next to your brisket, that's going to give you the most accurate temperature. And you also want to make sure that your brisket is never sitting over any burning part of the snake. Obviously, if your brisket is sitting over any burning part of the snake, it's just going to burn the underside of your brisket. But for now, for the first hour or two of this cook, we're not going to open our lid. We're just going to focus on stabilizing our temperature off, and we'll come back once we're a bit further into this cook. Alright, so we're almost 2 hours into this cook, and that snake we set up should last us 10 to 12 hours. We've been holding nice and stable around our target temperature, and if I'm within 10 to 15 degrees around that range, I'm happy. And as always, if I want to increase temperature, I'll open up that bottom vent. If I want to decrease, I'll close it down a little bit. It's always going to be easier to increase your temperature, as all you've got to do is open up that bottom vent. Sometimes it can be challenging bringing your temperature down. If you've closed your bottom vent down all you can, there are other things you can do. You can put a water pan in to help absorb some temperature. If you've already got a drip tray below your brisket, you can just pour some water in that. You can shut your top vent down a little bit. I don't like to do that too much as you risk choking your fire. Or another option is just simply taking some of those burning briquettes out of your fire. You're going to have to make different adjustments every time you're smoking something. There's so many variables that contribute to Weber kettle fire management. The outside temperature, the wind, the size of whatever you're smoking contributes a lot, as that's going to absorb a lot of heat, the type of fuel you're using, and much more. But if you follow and understand everything I've just mentioned, that's really going to help you maintain a nice stable fire. But for now, let's have a look at how this brisket's coming along, and we might need to rotate our cooking grate as well. Alright, so we'll take our lid off. That brisket is looking very nice. Our snake will start creeping below our brisket soon, so what I'm going to do is just rotate our cooking grate. And now that's going to give us a few more hours burn time before it gets back under there. As you can see, I've got a temperature probe clipped onto our cooking grate so we can keep an eye on our temperatures. And what I'm going to do now is just give our brisket a nice spritz with some water. That's just going to help keep our brisket nice and moist, and it's also going to help with our bark formation. All right, now we're going to put our lid back on, and you also want to make sure you're rotating your lid so it's always opposite to where the fire's burning. So every time you open your lid, you're letting a bunch of oxygen in there, which is going to fire up your briquettes and potentially cause a temperature spike. So keep an eye on your temperature for the next 10 to 15 minutes once your lid goes back on, and you might have to make some running adjustments. Once you've had a play around with something like a Weber kettle and you understand fire management, move on to a barbecue that's going to suit your lifestyle. So if you're very time poor, you might want to look at something like a pellet smoker, or if you really love playing with fire, you might want to look at something like an offset smoker. And then you've got a bunch of barbecues in between, like Kamados, drum smokers, cabinet smokers, and much more. It's all about finding a barbecue that works for you, and like I said, that suits your lifestyle. So we're going to let this brisket go for another hour or two until I'm really happy with that bark, then we'll look to wrap it up. All right, so we're just over 4 hours into this cook. Let's have a look at this brisket, and I reckon we're going to be ready to wrap this up. That bark's looking good. I reckon we can get this out and wrap it up. So we'll get our brisket out, and then I'll just put it down on 2 layers of foil. And I'm just going to add the liquid from the drip tray underneath. Now we can wrap it up nice and tight. All right, I think it's very important to use good quality foil. If you don't have good quality foil, then just use 3 or 4 layers if you have to. But now this is wrapped up, let's get it back in the Weber. We'll put a probe in each end and we'll let it keep going. All right, so our fire's burning over here. We're a bit under halfway through our snake, so I reckon we've still got that 10 to 12 hour burn time. Now I'm gonna put a probe in the point and the flat end of the brisket. Then we'll get our lid back on and let it keep going. So before I wrap my brisket, I'm always looking for that nice bark, and I want to be at an internal temperature of around 160 Fahrenheit or 70-ish degrees Celsius. I don't get too fussed if I'm 10 to 20 degrees either side of that. As long as that bark is looking nice, I'm happy to wrap. And there's a few different methods you can use when it comes to wrapping your brisket. You can either wrap it in butcher's paper, wrap it in foil like we have today. You can even leave it unwrapped for the whole cook, or you can boat your brisket where you're basically wrapping the bottom half of it in foil. It all comes down to personal preference. Wrapping your brisket in butcher's paper will help it breathe a bit more, preserving that bark. Wrapping it completely in foil, you will sacrifice some of that bark, but you will speed up the cooking time. But I'll show you a bit later on what we can do to bring some of that bark back. So have a play around and find a method that works for you. But for now, we're gonna let this brisket go, and we're gonna come back once we're ready to check for probe tenderness. We're going to start to do that once our brisket hits an internal temperature of around 205 Fahrenheit or 96 degrees Celsius. And you want to keep an eye on both ends of your brisket. You want to make sure they're cooking evenly. If one end is way ahead of the other, you want to make sure that the end that's behind is towards the hotter part of your fire. Making sure both ends of your brisket are cooking even is super important. You don't want one to be way ahead of the other, otherwise one's going to overcook while the other is potentially still underdone. So keep that in mind when smoking brisket, but for now, we'll be back once we're ready to check for probe tenderness. All right, so we're 8.5 to 9 hours into this cook, and we've hit 205 Fahrenheit or 96 degrees Celsius in both ends of our brisket. So let's open it up and have a probe around. All right, so that's actually probing really nice. So what we're going to do now is just boat our brisket for about half an hour to bring that bark back on the top. All right, and then we'll get our lid back on and check back in soon. All right, so we've actually let the brisket go for a bit closer to an hour, and that bark is looking incredible now. So what I'm going to do is very carefully lift this brisket out. And that is going to go into this tray. Then I'm going to pour those wrap juices in. Then this is going to steam off for a couple of minutes, then we'll rest it. All right, so when it comes to resting, you want to rest it in a place where it's going to keep the brisket nice and warm. Something like a Cambro is perfect, or if you've got an esky, even in your oven at the lowest setting around 70 degrees Celsius works well. And I like to rest my briskets for at least an hour. That just allows all of those juices to relax back throughout the whole cut, so you get a nice consistent eating brisket. I want to serve this brisket in about an hour, so we'll give it a rest for an hour. I'll let it go on the Cambro, then we'll come back to slice and serve it. All right, so we've got our Victorinox slicer, we've got our flat, our point. I know the grain is running this way, so we're going to slice across it. I'm just going to cut it in half first. That is looking good. So from here, we can keep slicing that same way back through the flat. All right, and we'll grab a slice out. That fat's rendered down nicely. There's a great amount of moisture through that flat. Slice is a little bit thick, but it bends nicely. Pulls apart with ease. That's a good brisket. All right, so if we move these slices out the way, you'll notice you've got the point muscle over this side. So what we'll do is we'll turn the brisket around and take our point slices off. And these slices here are some of my favorite. So you want to just keep slicing until you don't have much of that point muscle left. So I reckon this will be our last slice. And then what we can do is take the rest of the point muscle off like that. And just chop it into cubes. And then we'll come back and slice the rest of the flat underneath. And as you can see, end to end, juicy, tender, beautiful brisket. All right, so we'll try a bit of that flat we pulled apart. That's really good. Well, there you have it. There's my beginner's guide to smoking a brisket. As you can see, you don't need anything fancy to produce great results. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the comments below. Make sure you've subscribed to our channel so you don't miss our next videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.